I met Janet on the porch at Adams Morgan one steamy summer night in Washington. It was a typical summer day. The heat and humidity were over 100, and I was soaked through. No one in their right mind would stay in Washington in July. No wonder the creatures in Congress are running away for a 5-week vacation. But my graduate commitments kept me tied to this place, so I stood there, suffering. It was damn painful. The District of Columbia was created from lands given by the states of Maryland and Virginia, and our selfish founders would never have given away land suitable for agriculture. Instead, they gave the country an excellent piece of swamp near the Potomac. And although the area is now being developed with expensive real estate, the essence of the pristine quagmire is still felt. Two things immediately stood out to me about my future wife. First, she was lying on a shabby sofa on the veranda, clearly drunk, which promised a solution to my dryness problem. I was going through a long period of stagnation in my sex life, so romance was the last thing I needed. Secondly, she had beautiful breasts. It may seem superficial to be attracted to a woman because of her breasts, but as they say, you can't remember personality. She had a sweet oval face, not beautiful, but pleasant, and very thick brown hair that flowed down her back in waves. She had an incredibly sexy mouth with very full and expressive lips. Movie stars pay fortunes for lips like these. She wasn't unconscious or anything like that. It was just clear that her judgment might be seriously impaired. In short, she was exactly what I was looking for in a woman. I'm not a predator. I would never force a girl against her will. I'm just someone who usually needs a lot of alcohol to succeed. The fact is that I find it easier to get along with women if their powers of observation are reduced to such an extent that they do not notice my innate lack of subtlety. I sat down next to her. She smiled at me stupidly and hummed, "I was hoping you'd come talk to me." This was something new. Usually, when I sit down next to a beautiful girl, I hear, "Fuck off, you freak." I am average in every way, in height, weight, and appearance, and my approach to women really needs improvement. So women usually decide that life is too short to waste time talking to me. That one actually said she hoped I would talk to her because it was new. I tried to put on my best Prince Charming face and said, "Do we know each other?" "Damn, that wasn't very charming," she said in one of those fuzzy, drunken voices that indicate she's far gone. "I was in your cryptology class last year. Don't you remember me?" Wow, at least she saw me in my element. I thought to myself, any woman who takes an advanced code-breaking class is a real nerd, and I'm the king of it. Maybe it will compensate for some of the factors I lack, such as looks, money, and sex appeal. Not to mention some aspects of personal hygiene. Actually, this drunk little nerd might be the girl I've been looking for my whole life. But I still didn't remember her. I asked her what her name was, and she told me, Janet Askew. I remembered Janet Askew, but that girl was about the size of a killer whale, and she had bangs that made her look like she had just stepped out of a 1950s Archie and Veronica comic book. This petite woman had a very slender and curved figure with magnificent breasts, and was dressed as if she had graduated from Choate. I looked puzzled. She giggled stupidly and said, "You knew me before I lost weight. I had problems after my parents divorced, and I gained weight while I was in your class. It took a lot of therapy and a crash diet, but now I'm back to its normal state." I looked at her carefully a second time. She wasn't a beauty, but she was incredibly sexy. She had the open, sweet girl next door face and those aforementioned breasts. But she also had long, slender legs and nice, round hips in tight jeans. The small yellow tank top with spaghetti straps showed off about 10 centimeters of prime dark cleavage. She looked tempting, so I decided to kiss her. Remember, we were sitting in the dark on the front porch, outside of a loud party, and we met just a minute and a half ago. She surprised me by not slapping me, screaming, or running to the police. Instead, she wrapped one arm around my neck, pressed herself against me, and opened her mouth for the hottest kiss I had ever experienced. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment all her life. I don't believe in random luck, but it was a long, dry time, so I was not in the mood to look for a catch. I started fiddling with her bra. We heard people approaching in response to the noise, so we just sat there casually until half the party thundered past us and ran out onto the sidewalk looking for the source of the noise. She looked at me. I looked at her, and we both laughed. We spent about 15 minutes together, but I just knew I was going to marry this delightfully strange little woman. The next evening, we realized the inevitable. This happened during a night session as muggy as the weather in Washington. We got married just 4 months later and settled into a nice little apartment down the Red Line in Shady Grove. I know you're probably thinking it was stupid to get married so quickly, but Janet's charm really clouded my judgment. I should have suspected something if I had time to think about it. But Janet was so attractive, and I needed her so much. The first few months together were idyllic. I couldn't imagine a more compatible woman or a more satisfying lifestyle. She and I just got along well. We had sex a lot, but we also did all the fun things you could think of in a city with unlimited entertainment options. Everyone thought we were the perfect couple. Some couples hang on each other in a wet, saccharine kind of love. Janet was a very smart woman, and our lives were built on our shared intelligence. We joked and teased each other. We passed puns around to each other like a good comedy couple, and in general, we shared a gentle, ironic view of the world. It was hard not to love a woman who saw irony and humor in everything she did. It was almost too good to be true, and of course, this was indeed the case. The first sign that change was coming came when I met her father. We got married in a quick civil ceremony, as is customary among nerds, but she pestered me for months to meet her father, just to get his blessing. So we took the Acela train and headed to New York for the weekend. I knew her father lived in Manhattan. I didn't know it was overlooking Central Park in the 80s. It turned out that Dad made his money the old-fashioned way. He inherited them. And as F. Scott Fitzgerald said, "The rich are different from you and me." Dad treated me with the same contempt that the lord of the manor would show to any disheveled peasant his stupid daughter had just brought home. He seemed to expect me to reach for my forelock every time I addressed him. Long story short, I hated him from the moment we met. Janet also changed 180 degrees. She went from being open and friendly to being sarcastic and arrogant. It was clear that she thought the little people were inferior to her. Being one of the little people, I was stunned. It was also clear that the separation between father and mother was the result of father's debauchery, and Dad didn't try to hide it. He clung to his right to seduce any woman he met with the same fanatical confidence with which Charles I must have had the divine right of kings. Unfortunately, I learned what this meant in the worst possible way. He drove us across the park to Carlisle for dinner. This experience was so out of my control that I knew he had planned it simply to show me how sublime he was. Janet wore a tight little black dress and heels that showed off the goods. She turned heads everywhere we stopped. Both she and her father were the picture of a sophisticated New Yorker. I'm not very good. I didn't really do anything shameful. But I wasn't the star of the show either. Dad kept asking me about what I was doing, and I tried to explain to him about the offer I had just received from Georgetown. At first, it was the position of associate professor. This is not normal in academia. In fact, I have done very well in this regard. His response was to dismiss me as a teacher, which I think I was. But from the tone of his voice, it seemed that anyone could do this, but this is not the case. I definitely wasn't making the kind of money his daughter was used to, but I was well on my way to success in my chosen field. Later, I remembered all the consequences, but at the time I felt inadequate and angry, because I saw nothing in this man's own achievements that could justify his high opinion of himself. Except, of course, that he was born into the right family. I was a little hurt that Janet didn't protect me, but I saw that she had daddy issues, and I loved her, so I was willing to give her the opportunity to communicate with her father. On the other hand, it did not increase my trust in her. I was also bothered by the way her father treated her. It was like she was his date, and what's worse, she allowed it, which didn't make me happy at all. They both got drunk. I pushed the two of them into a taxi, and we went back through the park to 86th Street. I was driving in front, and they were both sitting in the back. The next morning, the woman I knew as my wife magically reappeared. Her body language, voice, and behavior changed 180 degrees. It was as if she had taken off yesterday's image like a robe and hung it in the closet of her father's guest room. It was actually kind of creepy. We took a taxi to Penn Station, and she was as energetic and cheerful as ever. It was like casting out an evil spirit from our marriage. So I made a mental note to stay away from Templeton Askew. Janet's transition from one person to a completely different person would have bothered me if it had continued. But it was just a day, and it didn't bother me too much. That's how it should have been. The next 5 years flew by on blissful wings. The main feature of that period was the data compression algorithm that I came up with. Data compression is at the heart of computer vision, which has applications in everything from search engines to cruise missiles. So, for us nerds, this is the holy grail. In my last days at GWU, I worked on an excellent lossless algorithm, and I perfected it 2 years later. I'm too naive to do actual production, but I had a friend named Scott. He was a genius when it came to bringing products to market, so he did the heavy lifting, and I got 40% of the shares as a silent partner. Our first contract was with Raytheon. Almost immediately, the targeting system for their Turkmsmack Block Roman 4 became much more capable, and my bank account became unimaginably larger. I'm a nerd. I don't care about money, and I don't know anything about finance, so I had Scott take care of it all. And I never discussed our financial situation with Janet. In my opinion, this would sound self-congratulatory, and nerds don't brag about how much they earn. Conquest points in World of Warcraft, yes, but never money. I just continued to live as if nothing had changed. Later, I was very glad that I did just that. Money was a blessing only because it gave me the freedom to do whatever I wanted for the rest of my life. I continued teaching and loved it. Therefore, I retained my position in the faculty. But I did buy a house in Georgetown. I paid in cash. Janet didn't seem to notice. I think she thought I was up to my eyeballs in debt. The only real change was that it was now easy to walk to campus. Janet herself went through a huge transformation. The 23-year-old girl I met that hot night in Adams Morgan was now a 28-year-old woman with a style I could only dream of. When I first met her, she was a sweet and bubbly, sexy girl. But as she approached her late 20s, her face became more refined and her body rounded out. She always had magnificent breasts, and she remained just as juicy and proud. But now her thighs and buttocks were breathtaking, round and muscular. She was truly a magnificent-looking woman. She never asked about money. She just always had them. Accordingly, she has mastered all the rich lady techniques, dressing, grooming, and fashion that differentiate the simply beautiful from the stunning. In fact, she was now many kilometers above me on the social ladder. Unfortunately for me, I am not that sophisticated or educated, and I never will. I live mostly in my head, and I never wanted to be socially noticeable. My world is a bowed head and virtuality. It may be isolating, but it's the only place I'm truly happy. The good news was that my abilities and interests financed Janet's lifestyle. The bad news was that we started going in different directions. We may have been a perfect couple once, but now we were different people. Over time, we began to function in completely different areas. Janet was a woman who preferred black ties and the Kennedy Center. In my opinion, a good evening is sitting in Blues Alley. She liked the atmosphere at the Verizon Center. I really enjoyed the peace and quiet of our yacht on the Potomac. I think you can see where this is going, and it inevitably happened. Most of the time, we had a free and easy life. But it was obvious that we were no longer as closely connected, at least not in the same way as in the beginning. This manifested itself in occasionally tense conversations and a huge decline in the quality of our sex life. But I must confess that I did not see the torpedo coming until it actually struck. I realized that I seriously lacked sociability, and I knew some changes would be needed. but that was all I thought through. On the other hand, Janet has already completed this. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say, out the door. I returned from class one bright, sunny morning in May. The weather in Washington was in that short window of time where the term amazing best describes it. I placed my laptop bag on the hallway table. I entered the living room, whistling cheerfully under my breath, and I stopped dead in my tracks, amazed by what I saw. Janet sat nervously on the couch, holding the hand of a tall, very good-looking guy. Templeton Askew sat on the sofa opposite them. Every red light, horn, and alarm immediately went off in my head. Whatever is going to happen, it will be bad. Janet looked at me sadly and said the 5 words no husband wants to hear. Jake, we need to talk. I stared at her. She looked worried. Templeton grinned. Who the hell is this other guy? Was it her lawyer? In fact, he really was Janet's lawyer, but he was also her lover. She said, Jake, this really hurts me, but you need to know that I'm leaving you. I could just disappear, but I value the time we spent together and wanted to let you know personally. Damn it, I sat down in the nearest chair. I have no idea what was on my face, but my soon-to-be ex-father-in-law looked delighted. Was she leaving me? Where did this come from? I probably looked like the proverbial fish out of dry land. I babbled. Are you leaving me? Why? What have I done? What will happen to me? She showed fake concern and said, You'll be okay. I know that. You're a strong person. It's just that me and Burton have found each other again, and we can't be apart. Templeton said with contempt in every word, Janet and Burton have been together since childhood. He is the right man for her. Janet realizes that they should never have separated. Burton didn't actually cheat on her. He was just having fun. Now he's ready to settle down and Janet has agreed to be his wife. I said sadly, but she's my wife. Crap, listen to me. I sounded like a snotty little wimp. It was just fucking humiliating. My father's raw humiliation and smug tone pushed me over the edge. I didn't know that I could do it. But Bruce Banner probably didn't think so either. I just got angry. I turned to my father, not trying to control the anger in my voice. I'll rip your head off if you open your mouth again, you arrogant bastard. He began to open his mouth. I started to rise from the chair. He could see the real anger in my eyes. He made a silent gesture with his finger to his lips. I turned to the treacherous ex, as if no longer my wife, and said, Are you telling me that this worm is your former lover and that you are leaving me for him? How long have you been sleeping? The aforementioned worm said in a very offended tone, Now look here, old man. I turned to him and said, Where I come from, you and I should be beating each other right this second. So unless you want to go to the parking lot, I advise you to stay away from it. This is between me and my future ex-wife. He just sat there in disgust. I turned to her and said, Okay, cheater, over to you. How long has this been going on, and what do you propose to do next? Janet looked stunned and very angry. She didn't expect this. She said, Dad hasn't felt like you're the right person for me since our first trip to New York. He urged me to give Burton another chance. Burton came all the way here to accompany me to the Washington National Opera last November. This was the event that I refused to go to because it was too boring. I remember that. She had a black tie party in the suite I bought for her at the Jefferson. I expected a scandal when I told her I didn't want to go. She came home the next day and was as sweet and loving as ever. I said, So you've been having fun with him for 6 months? She looked distressed and said condescendingly, What humiliating words, Jake. This is not in your favor. But to answer your question, Burton and I became a couple from that night on. I'm surprised you haven't heard about this since we didn't hide our relationship. But then again, you don't travel in our circles. We want this to be permanent now, and I need you to set me free so I can marry the person I should have been with in the first place. I'm sure you understand that it's over between us. I love you, but I haven't been in love with you for a while. I looked at the traitor and her two-faced father. Then I turned my attention to the worm. I said, "So you want to marry her, knowing what a slut she is?" He muttered, "Now look here. You can't talk about Janet like that." I said, "How can I talk about her? I gave her all the love and devotion that was in me. I gave her money so she could pretend to be a community elder. All I expected was to raise children with her and die in her arms. As a reward, she's been entertaining you for the past 6 months." They both exploded. I looked at them with murder in my eyes. They both fell silent. I calmly addressed everyone in the room without showing any anger in my voice. "Is this really what you all want?" The brat looked thoughtful. Dad looked outraged, and Janet looked serious. Janet said with anger in her voice, "This is what we all want, Jake. You have to let me go. I've already moved all my stuff to Burton's, and when I leave here, I won't be coming back. I don't need anything from you, just a quick divorce. Burton has a lot more money than you, so I don't need anything except your blessing." I looked at her truly perplexed. The stupid girl really expected me to smile and say, "Okay, good luck with your life." Seriously, I couldn't imagine how someone could be so naive. I sincerely looked into their eyes and said, "I hope you all burn in hell." This caused everyone to gasp. After that, I got up and left the apartment. If I had to go somewhere else, I would have killed every single one of them. I'm not usually impulsive. I think everything over in my head. So I walked along the sea and O shoreline to Key Park, trying to cool down. I sat on a bench and watched the planes slowly fly over Roslyn towards DCA Airport. It was a beautiful day, and my thoughts were racing wildly. I don't know how other people react to personal betrayal. I was stunned. I knew betrayal when I saw it. I just didn't know what to feel about it. There wasn't much pain. Perhaps I didn't love her as much as I thought. However, there was now an emptiness in my soul. It was as if all the confidence drained out of me. I wasn't going to shed any tears for her. Perhaps because I don't think lamenting about lost love is particularly manly. Obviously, she was not who I thought she was, and she made her choice. So be it. Her passing did not affect the rest of my life. In fact, in some ways, nothing significant has changed. I was still young and richer than I ever imagined. It was fortunate that Janet and her father despised me so much that they never took any interest in my financial affairs. A bad assumption in the information age. Take Bill Gates, for example. I knew two things for sure. First and foremost, I will never trust another person again. Against my better judgment, I gave my heart to Janet unconditionally and looked where it got me. So women can be crossed off the list of mistakes I won't make again in the future. Second, I needed to get out of here. Thanks to my algorithm, I could do whatever I wanted in life. And the last thing I needed was a reminder of how bad my existence had become. My life was already meaningless, so I should have had a little fun, by the way. I walked back to the Rebbe station at Gare de la Plaine. St. Denis is often described as Detroit with couscous. Looking back at the destroyed buildings, I understood why. 20 minutes ago, I was standing at one of the third access levels of the tunnels at the Stade de France. From this vantage point, I could see about 80,000 of my fellows. What the French call football misses me, but I didn't come here to watch the game. I took the Rue to St. Denis to assess where I was in my recovery. It was a test of my mood, so to speak. Some go to church. Some sit on the top of a mountain with their legs crossed and mutter, "Om." I come to sporting events to try to understand my place in the grand scheme of things. I like to see the big picture when I think about where I am, and there's nothing like a stadium full of people to get a useful insight into where you stand in relation to life. I looked at the backs of the heads in the countless rows in front of me. All I could see was a mass of hair. There was a variety of colors and lengths, but neither owner stood out. They were invisible skins in a boiling sea of wool, most likely like a flock of lemmings. I shook my head and walked back down the steps. Behind me, the entire stadium erupted in applause as someone performed an epically heroic feat that would be replaced by another epically heroic feat next week. I sighed. At least I confirmed what I came to find out. Insignificance is the human condition. I took the Paris metro back to the FDR stop at the Arc de Triomphe. Then I walked back to the hotel. I stayed at the Hotel California in the 8th arrondissement. Check out this place. It's real. I wonder if the French understand the irony of the lyrics to the old Eagles song, "You can check out any time, but you can never leave." My location could not have been more suitable. I've been living in Paris for the last 4 months. Since the divorce became official, I needed to be anywhere but Washington, so I asked for a sabbatical to collect my thoughts. Not surprisingly, Georgetown was happy to give it to me. My classes this past semester really left a lot to be desired. Meanwhile, the deceiver became a prominent figure in the public life of Washington. It seems like her sharing with me was a debut of sorts. The happy couple looked disgustingly happy and very much in love. But the smiling photos of Janet and Worm in the Post's public news pages really spoiled my morning mess. She looked as arrogant as he did. Janet was clearly a chameleon. She could absorb and imitate the personality of whoever stood next to her. Her betrayal was hard to accept, but she was also clearly a complete psychopath. I think psychiatrists call it dissociative disorder. I first saw this when she transformed into a completely different person during our visit to her father in New York. I just didn't get it then. Whoever was living in her head at that moment probably didn't know the others existed. That's why she was able to deceive me for so long. But she was clearly two, perhaps three, completely different and separate individuals. Janet's personality, which I suspect was her main one, was also unassuming and warm in the way that others were cold, calculating, cruel, and arrogant. The root cause of the various personalities living in her attic is undoubtedly related to some devastating event during her formative years. Her father was definitely causing the switch, so no doubt he was something important in her life. Regardless, Janet's situation definitely made me give up on women forever. What is a completely disillusioned and cynical nerd doing in a place like Paris, you ask? I'm not particularly sophisticated or worldly. The answer is unfamiliarity. What happened to Janet had shattered all my inevitabilities, and I needed a reset. At least if I ever wanted to get back into the game of life. Until the moment my ex-wife dropped the bomb on my future plans, I was on a path that was probably set in the 3rd grade. I will study well. I would like to find a good job. I would marry a caring and faithful woman, and we would raise 186 children and die in each other's arms. It didn't work out so well, did it? So I went back to the drawing board for a new start. And I didn't want to reinstate myself in any environment even remotely related to my old life. So I deliberately chose not to live with the British. It would be too familiar, and I didn't want any transferable assumptions. I wanted to get away from life as far as possible, and Paris is a pretty foreign place for a guy who is foreign going to Comic-Con. But as Hemingway said, Paris is also a traveling feast, and frankly, my move was doing its job. Every day, my old life faded further and further from my memory, and my self-confidence began to return. I would probably meet Bob Cohn on Rue de Berry at Le Fouquet's on the Champs-Élysées. We could watch the world pass by behind our pasties and legauder, but it was raining heavily. The city can be a romantic dream at some times of the year, but on this April day it was cold, gray, and gloomy. Robert Cohn was one of a group of English-speaking expats who settled in the Parisian scene. It was his way of avoiding doing anything adult and responsible in the States. We were all here because we were looking for something, and we moved in the same circles because of our common language. He was another guy who inherited rather than earned his fortune, but he was a very tough guy, despite everything. He was taller than me by a couple of inches, handsomer than Worm, and probably weighed about 220 pounds. He played college football at Harvard as a linebacker, and he was the epitome of an alpha male, smart, arrogant, and a little more smug than Louis Roman 15. For some reason, he almost followed me. In fact, not a day went by that he didn't call or ask to meet. I was pretty sure it wasn't because of my good looks and charm. Perhaps he was attracted by the world weariness that I simply exuded, or perhaps he had some idea of who I really was. At that stage, I was filthy rich. I know I didn't act or dress like a multimillionaire. I was still sticking to the nerd style rather than the La Dolce Vita lifestyle. But all of us nerds are like that. Money means absolutely nothing to us. That's why we don't monitor them. My stay in California cost serious money, but it was a drop in the bucket compared to how quickly they added up. The most expensive thing I owned was a condominium that almost doubled in value on paper, but I paid cash for it, so my only real connection was through the current tenant, and it only made me richer. When he walked through the street door of the small bar at the entrance to California, Cohn was dressed in the style of Ralph Lauren's preppy collection. He moved like a big cat. Gracefulness is the word that comes to mind. In fact, he was a really tough and dangerous guy. But since he always had money, he could afford to be careless, as if he had been born to illustrate the word. He was wearing a very expensive leather jacket paired with a black t-shirt. His thick, curly brown hair was covered with a fedora that looked like he had liberated it from Indiana Jones. The sparkle in his sparkling blue eyes allowed him to conquer women almost on demand, and she sparkled, addressing all the women in the bar. He walked up, shaking off the rain, and said, "Where were you today? I tried to change the meeting place, but you didn't answer your calls." I didn't want to tell him that I spent the day in St. Denis feeling miserable. I would sound like a coward, which I probably was. So instead, I told him that I had spent the day writing articles and didn't want to be disturbed. I actually wrote several articles for various magazines as an excuse for why I was in Paris. This seemed to satisfy him. He said, "I wanted to spend the evening at Bugsy's. Bill and Mike will meet us there." These two were also former military men. They served in the 173rd Parachute Regiment, based in Italy, and they remained in Europe after their dismissal. They lived together in a shabby apartment in the 18th arrondissement near Montmartre. Bill Gorton was a really tough guy. Mike Campbell had problems with PTSD. The Sky Soldiers, as they call themselves, faced significant challenges during their time in Iraq and the Lagar province of Afghanistan. Mike struggled with the consequences of this. The rain stopped when we reached Rue de Berry. Bugsy's was less than a mile down Rue du Faubourg, and it seemed pointless to take a taxi, even if you could get some arrogant Parisian taxi driver to stop for us. So we just walked for the 15 minutes it took to get there. Bugsy's was a cross between an American sports bar and some French take on 1920s Chicago. It was always crowded, mainly because it served the best cheeseburgers in the universe, and it was a place for Americans like Cohn and me to visit. American tourists were everywhere at the legendary Harry's on Rue Daunou. Given the drink prices there and the Midwestern clientele, I can't imagine the likes of Sinclair Lewis, Hemingway, or even the Duke of Windsor would be caught drinking there now. Tables were usually scarce, but Bill and Mike arrived much earlier and held one for us. I knew they had been there for a while because Mike was already drunk. However, as we pushed through the crowd, my attention wasn't on my two friends. Cohn and I both examined the woman sitting next to Mike. Words like magnificent don't really describe a woman like her. Every beautiful woman requires male attention, but this one was in a category of its own, and it wasn't her looks that made her stand out. She radiated an exceptional, blazing sexuality that made you think of wildfires, pounding jungles, wild dances, and fertility goddesses. Some legendary actresses and models have this quality. I've never experienced this before, but I immediately recognized it in her. Meanwhile, Khan seemed about to propose to her right there. We sat in the outside seats. Mike seemed to be leaning against the wall with his arm around the woman sitting next to him. Khan beat me to it, taking a seat next to her. The woman looked at Cohn with the same interested look with which a cat looks at a tasty canary, and said in a very well-placed voice from Belgravia, "Lady Brett Ashley, who are you?" Even sitting across the table, I was captivated by Lady Brett. She had perfectly balanced features, huge, sexy eyes, rosebud lips, a long, pointed, aristocratic nose, and a white cascade of golden hair. She was dressed casually, but expensively, and she wore enough gold to make Montezuma envious. Her $20,000 Rolex Yachtmaster with diamond set watch completed the ensemble. But it was her smoky gray eyes that held both Khan and me captive. They simultaneously conveyed both a sense of generational superiority and obscene pagan mating rituals. Khan's tongue almost fell out onto the floor, like a classic cartoon wolf. He said, as if stuttering, "Robert Cohn, at your service, my lady." I have never seen him embarrassed in the presence of a woman. Mike brought her, but since he was out of shape, Cohn became the new object of her attention, and he enjoyed it. She turned to me, and with the same cheerful look, filled with sexuality, asked, "Who are you?" I said, "Jake Barnes, Lady Ashley. Con and I are in the same boat as Bill and Mike." She laughed hoarsely and said, "You Americans have such a cute way of using archaic slang. Does this mean you are all fascinated by me?" This was accompanied by a searing glare that would make the Lord of Hell stand up. So I casually replied, "Some of us want to seduce you in the sense you mean. Some of us are just here for the cheeseburgers. You can't get a good burger in France except at Bugsy's." At that point, I excused myself and went to get beers for me and my friend, which were also great. The French are amazingly good at brewing beer. The bar was the usual crowd of people, so I had to be away for a while. I couldn't get anyone to serve me. It wasn't because I'm American. That's because it was Paris. All the waiters in town treated customers with the same dismissive, rude attitude. When I returned, Lady Ashley was leaning back against her companion while flirting with Khan on the other side. Lady Brett was the complete package, an outstanding face and an exceptional body. She was oriented towards Cohn because she was leaning on Campbell's chest with her head on his shoulder. He had his arm over her left shoulder, one hand laying idly on the front of her body, casually cupping one of her breasts. Some women might feel awkward about someone mindlessly grabbing their breasts, but not Brett. She treated Campbell's actions as a tribute to her excellence. Khan couldn't take his eyes off her, and she gave him a full boost. I wondered if Campbell saw what was happening. Indeed, it was difficult to conclude that the lady had many moral principles. I left my opinion alone because Brett was clearly open about her promiscuity, unlike some of the other sneaky sluts I knew. I put a beer in front of Khan. He looked at me with a sly smile and went back to seducing the lady. His devilishly carefree blue eyes sparkled with mischief. Gordon and I exchanged an amused glance as I sat down next to him. I knew he didn't think Mike was the sharpest knife in the drawer, but watching Cohn try to win over Brett right in front of him qualified the guy for a Guinness World Record. I really liked Gordon. He had always been a paratrooper, trim and fit, mid-30s and tough. But most importantly, he had a sense of humor, and this quality was always visible on the surface. He was practically laughing out loud at the virtual threesome that was happening on the other side of the table. With all the sexual tension in the air, it was difficult to have a rational conversation. But I asked Gordon what they were doing anyway. He told me they were planning a trip to the Monaco Grand Prix in 3 weeks. He said, "We have a friend who has a boat there, and he invited us to join him. He says race cars drive right past where he's moored. It's going to be a party, man. Why don't you join us?" I wondered how Gordon had an acquaintance rich enough to take a premium seat at an event such as this. But the two traveled a lot during their war days. Plus, they had this macho vibe, so it's no surprise that some rich amateur wanted to have them around as showpieces. It turned out that the man who owned the boat was Kuwaiti. This made the connection even more interesting considering what Bill and Mike were doing in those parts. The more I thought about it, the more I liked it. I spent too much time staring at my belly button because of Janet, and never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that I would find myself in Monaco, especially at such a famous event as the Monte Carlo Grand Prix. I would never have gone there myself, but Bill Gordon was someone I could really enjoy being with, and Mike Campbell was a fun guy, despite his drinking problem, so we agreed. Meanwhile, Cone and Lady Ashley finished virtually kicking each other. There was some kind of mutual understanding between them. Gorton and I didn't care what it was, and Mike was too drunk to notice. We all went our separate ways on a rainy Parisian night. I walked slowly back to the hotel. Bill, Mike, and the lady went to their ragtag apartments in Montmartre. Con set off in an unknown direction. I got the impression that a lady was waiting for him somewhere. I actually didn't see Con for quite a while after that. Monaco is a full day's drive down the A6 and A7 from Paris. Both Bill and Mike shared a used Peugeot 107. There was no way I was going to sit in that tin can for 9 hours, so I bought a Range Rover Evoque for the road trip. I told them I rented it. They wanted to know where I got the money since it cost $500 a day to rent this car. I told them that I had a rich uncle who died and left me enough money for one gross luxury. I arranged accommodation in Hermitage. But I didn't want the guys to know how rich I was, so I told them I'd sleep in my car in the mountains. I didn't feel bad about lying to them. My money is no one's business but my own. They stopped on a boat with their friend. I dropped them off at the water taxis, which raced towards the moored boats. I told them I'd see you at Explorer's Pub for lunch the next day. It would be an easy walk for them as it is near Port Hercules. We could then plan the 3 days we would spend in the city. I think they sympathized with me because there was no room on the ship, so to speak. But that didn't stop them from leaving me on the pier. A boat, which they were heading for, was slightly smaller than an aircraft carrier. Their Kuwaiti friend must have been swimming in oil money. I pulled up to the Hermitage Hotel, which was only a few minutes' drive from where I had left the boys. Driving through the maze of streets to get to the hotel was a bit tricky, but luckily the French drove on the same side of the road as us. I checked into the hotel. It was only 8 in the evening, so I decided to go down to the Crystal Terrace for a nightcap. Sitting there and looking at the yachts in the port of Hercules, I thought, maybe I should buy one too. I could afford it. I was sipping Pernod when I felt uneasy around me. It was like the way zebras and ostriches on the Serengeti crane their necks when a lion appears. The absolutely beautiful couple caught all the attention. They just appeared on the terrace, holding hands. He was tall and very strong, incredibly handsome, but his partner overshadowed him with her beauty. Even though I had seen her before, I still had to freeze in amazement. She was amazing. Her face and figure were simply exceptional, and she just radiated sexiness when she walked. Her partner had one of those, I can't believe my eyes moments. This was followed by a look of pure pleasure. He seemed really happy to see me. They approached the place where I was sitting. He smiled, and she looked as incomprehensibly desirable as always. I smiled friendly. The main thing was to give the impression that I knew they would be here. I suspected this, but I wasn't sure. Now I was. I said, "Have a seat, Robert. Long time no see." I then stood up to offer the lady a chair. As she sat down, she gave me a look that nearly melted the soles of my boat shoes. She said, "Robert told me you were very rich, but I didn't believe it until I saw it for myself." I looked at Robert. He gave a mysterious shrug and said, "My father runs the hedge fund through which your man in Washington invests your money." I sat down and said, "I haven't seen you in forever, buddy. I guess that's the reason." And nodded towards Lady Brett. She settled into a chair. Even this movement made her chest bounce slightly. She said, "Yes, Robert took me to Ibiza for 3 weeks. We have become much closer to each other." I turned to her. "Have you talked to Mike Campbell recently?" She replied, "The last time I spoke to Mike was the day after you and I met. I told him I was going home to visit my family," and she winked at Con with a seductive smile. I said, "Well, he and Bill Gorton are here for the Grand Prix. I assume you do too. Will this be a problem?" The lady looked at me like I was an idiot. She said, "I really hope so. It was just a temporary whim. He knows it." This was a gray area in the libertine code of conduct. She and Campbell were not married or even in an exclusive relationship, but the lady seemed to act like a honeybee, fluttering from flower to flower. I wondered what Khan thought about this. Of course, the opportunity to spend 3 weeks in paradise with a woman who looked like Lady Brett was probably worth putting up with her behavior. Besides, Robert was also a bit of a ladies' man. I got the impression that they were suitable for each other. We were sitting and talking when I felt someone else approach the table. It was a woman. She walked over, kissed Lady Brett on the cheek, and hugged Khan from behind, squeezing him tightly. He laughed lustfully. She said cheerfully, with an accent that had personal meaning to me, "What a wonderful evening, and who is he?" She nodded in my direction. The fact is that the British have even more pronounced accents than ours, and the mysterious woman spoke with an accent that I knew very well. This is because I studied with them at Cambridge. Whether from Oxbridge or other universities, every female academic in the UK sounds exactly like our guest. It's called received pronunciation, and it literally screams educated British elite. She quickly came up to me and extended her hand. She said, "Britannia Ashley, but everyone calls me Brit. I'm Brett's little sister. Our parents loved alliteration." I shook her hand, blushed, and muttered in response, looking somewhere at her knee level, "Jake Barnes." This was perhaps the most spectacular violation of all the rules of good manners that has ever occurred on the Crystal Terrace. But I'm a nerd, and this woman completely freaked me out. She was just as beautiful as Brett, but in a smaller and less overtly sexy package. Her thick honey blonde hair was cut into a preppy bob with subtle, feminine bangs. They framed her oval face perfectly while remaining natural and effortless. Her features were as smooth and proportional as her sister's, but her mouth was wider and full of gaiety. She had the same unusual gray eyes. But unlike Brett, her eyes simply radiated intelligence and a sense of humor. The rest of her was, as they say, impeccably put together. She wasn't as dramatically busty as her sister. Instead, she was long-legged, slender, and panther-like. At first glance, Brett was the more spectacularly attractive of the two. But that was until you compared them side by side and realized that Brit is the complete package: looks, brains, and toughness. Brett was sex personified. Brit was much more than that. I was just as stuttering as usual, so I just sat there. Brett said dismissively, "My sister is smart. She studies at Oxford and does something terribly boring. She works too much. We needed to get her away from her dusty computers this weekend so she could have some fun." I looked at Brit, and she actually blushed. She said defensively, "I enjoy working. My sister is the one who likes to have fun." I looked over at Brett. She looked at Con seriously, making hunting eyes. Brett snapped out of her reverie and said to the two of us, "Robert and I need to go up to our room. Will you be able to entertain each other for the rest of the evening?" Without even waiting for an answer, she stood up and began to pull Con towards the exit. I looked at Brit, and she raised her eyebrows in question and said, "Should we get something to drink, or are you leaving too?" I called the waiter over and ordered another pernod. Brit ordered white wine. Then there was silence. I could actually hear the crickets chirping and the noise of the port a couple of 100 meters in front of us. The silence was getting awkward, so I said, "Sorry, I'm not a very fun person to talk to. I'm not social at all, and I don't know what to say to a woman as beautiful as you." She looked amazed and said, "You think I'm beautiful? I always considered myself an ugly sister. You have no idea how hard it is to grow up in the shadow of someone like Brett." I said a little too emotionally, "I think you are the most beautiful woman I have ever met." Damn, that was exquisite. I understand why Janet couldn't wait to leave me. Britt looked at me thoughtfully and asked the eternal feminine question, "Are you married?" Apparently, she wasn't completely put off by me. I replied, trying to remain calm. I was married, but she chose someone better. Britt looked sympathetic and even covered my hand with hers. It was like electricity. I haven't thought about women for over a year, but her touch reminded me of how it happens. She said sincerely, "It must have been very painful." I replied, I don't know if it can be called pain. It was more like humiliation. I'm now in the wild world. I don't trust anyone anymore. Damn, that was too much information. I've talked too much. So I added, enough about my psychological state. What are you doing at Oxford? This question perked her up noticeably. She spent the next 15 minutes telling me with great enthusiasm about her research. Needless to say, Lady Britt Ashley was an accomplished scientist. This state of affairs was too ideal to be plausible. It's not by chance that ordinary people meet wonderful travel companions with a casual interest in programming and a handy sister to hook you up with. I fell into silence again. She looked at me with some concern and said, "What happened?" I was going to respond with the usual nothing, but then it dawned on me that I had a better way to distract her while I mentally tried to figure out how to leave. I said, "Your sister is a very interesting woman." She looked disgusted and said, "Interesting is one way of putting it. Brett has no sense of morality. The only way she can tell right from wrong is if she feels good after she does something. She's always been wild, but her extreme cuteness gets her out of situations that would ruin most women. Any man who puts anything into her will be hurt." She looked at me with a sudden alarm and said, "I hope you are not one of her many admirers." I laughed and said, "I'm no one's fan. I gave up on women the moment my ex-wife betrayed me. I'm actually not a big fan of humanity in general." She looked sad and said, "So you have someone close. Don't you have anyone?" I looked at her open, sincere face and almost said, "Maybe you are." But I knew it could lead to something more, and I knew I couldn't handle it. In fact, old Lucifer has been dead since that fateful day. I realized that this was psychological, not physiological, but I simply had no control over my reactions. I was rational enough to admit that Janet was damaged, and that there were probably decent women in the world that I could trust and love. But another part of me knew for sure that every woman I met would eventually betray me. Plus, who am I to expect a better outcome? I'm sure every one of the lemmings at the Stade de France was also confident that they would succeed. So in a way, it was a blessing. I had no lustful impulses. I could enjoy life without trying to please anyone but myself, and company with a woman was just an unnecessary distraction. However, I still had memories and remembered how good it was when Janet and I were together. I just knew how the story ended, and I just couldn't write a different ending. So no, I wasn't going to start anything with this amazing woman, even if there was the slightest chance that it was real, that I sincerely believed it. She was too perfect. I stood up and said, "This was the best night I've had in the last year, and you're an amazing person. I hope we meet tomorrow." Then I turned and walked back to the elevators and my room. I glanced over my shoulder as I opened the patio door. Lady Britt was still sitting there. She looked both sad and disappointed. It seemed as if she was hoping for something more. Poor woman. I had a moment of regret. I wish I had met her on that hot veranda 7 years ago. Maybe my life would have turned out differently. But at the same time, she was beautiful, and what would she ever see in a nerd like me? The next day was as clear and sunny as the Mediterranean can be. I met the guys at the Explorer pub, as we had agreed. Both of them were suffering from crippling hangovers. I didn't feel particularly hungry either. The conversation with Lady Britt brought back many unpleasant memories, and I tossed and turned all night and could not sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about her, and it wasn't sexual attraction. Her soul spoke to me. Janet shared many of the same traits, at least the person I knew as Janet. But Lady Britt was much more. She embodied every quality I could ever hope to find in a woman or wife. She seemed to have all the qualities that I had always valued in another person: warmth and compassion, intelligence, fullness of life, hard work, and, apparently, honesty. They don't make people like that anymore, so she was probably perfectly prepared. I decided that Cone was the devil himself. It was stupid to think that way, especially since I was standing outside looking in. But I couldn't turn off the switch in my head. The Kuwaiti man who invited the guys onto his boat was with them. He was a smooth, plump little man who was 20 years older than me. It was clear that he had some previous connections with Bill and possibly Mike, and he acted as if he owed them something. I didn't ask. However, this guy had some serious money, and he secured access to the pits for Carb Day. Since no modern racer uses conventional suction, Carb Day is just a term. In the old days, this was when they manually tuned the car for the racetrack. Now everything is so computerized that they configure the settings on board from a workstation in the pits. But Saturday also determines the relative position on the grid. The Mercedes, Williams, Ferrari, Renault, and McLaren teams were all busy around us trying to get that last micro advantage for their drivers. And the drivers pushed their cars to get ahead. The Monaco Grand Prix has been held since 1929. The proximity of buildings, street lights, and other obstacles makes this event so dangerous that the course would never have been certified if it were not the original route. Consequently, whoever starts first usually finishes first in the narrow streets of Monte Carlo, especially because racers reach speeds of almost 200 mph on a straight line near the water. So there was probably more drama going on in the pits today than there will be tomorrow. As the four of us stood against the wall of the pits, the sound of the racers revving those high-tech engines and the Doppler effect of the cars whizzing past on the narrow city streets was absolutely breathtaking. The engines on these cars are limited to 1.6 liters. This is about 100 cubic inches in American measurements, or the displacement of a large Harley-Davidson motorcycle engine. However, the average Harley engine produces 8,120 horsepower. These engines produce between 600 and 750 horsepower. How they did it was what interested me, not the race itself. I watched a technician from the Williams team tuning one of their Mercedes engines. I hesitate to call him a mechanic because he only used computer equipment. At that moment, Cone and the Ashley sisters entered the pits. I looked back and Mike and Bill were talking to the Kuwaiti. I thought, damn, this is going to be awkward. As they headed to the center of the boxing area, Cone and Lady Brett came into Campbell's line of sight. I saw him do a double take. Then he instantly made the calculation. At that moment, he puffed up like a ruffled black grouse and rushed in their direction. Both Bill and I ran after him. When he got to Con, he spun him around and punched him in the side of the head. This knocked Cone off his feet. We arrived as Cone began to rise to answer Campbell. This could get ugly. I grabbed Cone's hand and said, "Don't do anything stupid. The police are here. He's not worth it." Bill and half the people around him held Mike back. The Kuwaiti arrived at about the same time as the gendarmes. There were a lot of heated conversations. I couldn't hear anything because at that moment a long crocodile of cars drove by. When the noise died down, I saw Bill, security, and the Kuwaitis leading Mike out of the pits towards the harbor. Bill seemed to have him in a grip while he did this. I looked at Khan and his two women. Brett wavered between entertainment and interest. Britt was terrified, and Khan rubbed the side of his head, looking annoyed. I said to Brett, "I thought you said it wouldn't be a problem." She said in her bored, noble tone, "I didn't think Mike would act like a child. I'm done with him. He needs to accept it." I thought, what a self-centered bitch. I wondered if she ever actually told Mike himself. A little voice in my head whispered, "They're all like that." I turned to Khan, "Are you okay?" He grinned defiantly and said, "I've been beaten even harder. I just didn't expect it." Britt looked at me strangely. She said, "It was very noble of you to intervene. It must have been difficult for you to intervene. I see you hate physical violence." I smiled sheepishly and said, "I'm a nerd. I've never been in a real fight in my life." I walked up to the barrier to pull myself together. Britt came and stood quietly next to me. As soon as the two lovers finished tormenting each other, they too approached the barrier. One of the Scuderia Ferrari drivers passed us when they did this. Whoever was driving the car made a quick maneuver inside the track, following the McLaren he was chasing, and passed it wheel to wheel, literally 4 feet away from us on the other side of the Armco. It was either incredibly brave or completely reckless, depending on your point of view. Still, it was a driver's masterpiece. The man in this cockpit must have been a grandmaster of the sport. The racer waved at us in apology as his shockwave nearly knocked us off our feet. He reappeared 2 minutes later while we were still recovering. He drove up the pit track, accelerating the engine as he slowed, and suddenly turned into the Ferrari pits. The mechanics helped him unfasten and remove his helmet. I heard Lady Brett sigh. If she was the very essence of feminine beauty, then the guy in the cockpit was her exact male counterpart. Damn, he was beautiful. He walked up to where we stood, his eyes never leaving Lady Brett's. Despite all the laws of logic, he must have noticed her as he rushed past us at 80 miles per hour. Racers are said to have exceptional vision and reflexes. This was certainly proof of that. Brett was truly impressive, though. Cohn was furious. I didn't blame him. He smiled charmingly at us all and said in heavily accented English, "Sorry about the tight passage. I was on my qualifying lap trying to pass this fool." He wasn't great, but no racer does. He looked like a Calvin Klein model, only maybe slimmer and better looking. And he had that classic 3-day stubble that must have been itchy under his helmet. He was also about 20 years old. He had big, soulful brown eyes and that pale-skinned, curly hair that all truly beautiful Iberians have. In fact, he was like a smaller, slimmer version of a young Antonio Banderas. It is not surprising that women threw themselves at his feet. He turned and extended his hand to Brett, introducing himself. "My name is Pedro Romero. I may be Spanish, but I ride for the Italians. What's your name, beauty?" Brett seemed to be elated as she extended her hand and mumbled breathlessly, "Lady Brett Ashley." If anything could enhance her accent, it was this moment. Cohn wrapped her arm around him and extended his other hand to Romero. He said, "And I'm Robert Cohn. Sorry, but we can't stay. We have a meeting." He then began to pull Brett towards the exit, leaving me, Britt, and Romero standing there in disbelief. It was definitely a rude departure, and I'm sure Romero understood why. With his looks and profession, I imagine he received this kind of treatment quite often from jealous husbands, lovers, and boyfriends. I extended my hand and said without further ado, "Jake Barnes, this is Lady Britt Ashley, Brett's sister." Since the guy had problems with English, I did not try to explain to him the meaning of alliteration. He looked at Britt, and I could see how he was sizing her up. The problem is that he came to the same conclusion as me. Britt was more attractive than Brett. If he had been a Sparrow missile, I would have heard his target lock signal loud and clear. His behavior completely changed. He did everything except not blink in her direction, like Pepe Le Pew. He said somewhat too politely, "I am very pleased to meet such a beautiful woman. Would you like to see what's behind our boxes? It is very interesting." She replied, "Thank you. Can Jake come with us?" It was a stupid question. He looked at me, put on his most sincerely sorry face, and said, "No, sorry, but I can only bring one guest at a time." My jealousy sensor went off the charts. Damn it, what was it? Feelings? It was like a paralyzed man who suddenly finds his legs itching like crazy. Britt looked sorry. She said, "Then I will have to decline your kind invitation, but you might want to join us for drinks after you've finished work for the day. We're having a little party on the Crystal Terrace tonight at 7. She smiled sweetly at Romero. Then she took me by the arm, turned around, and immediately began to drag me towards the exit of the pits. My heart was filled with joy. I forgot about the emotions a woman can evoke. This stunning and polite lady just chose to stay with me instead of leaving with the most handsome racer in the universe. I wondered what episode of The Twilight Zone I was in. It was both exciting and incredibly scary to realize the depth of feelings I had for Lady Britt Ashley. My first instinct was to ruthlessly suppress them. But Britt was nothing if not kind and polite to me. I wasn't going to reward her show of respect by acting like a jerk. However, I made a promise to myself to never get burned again, and this woman was walking through fire. As we walked, she chatted to me in her fruity, academic accent about how technicians adjust fuel and ignition timing parameters wirelessly using onboard propulsion systems. It was alarming. She seemed to be completely oblivious to the fact that the sexiest man in the world had just proposed to her. Or perhaps handsome, bold, and glamorous meant nothing to her. She held my hand on her full left breast as we walked, and I felt its softness in contrast to the hard body to which it was attached. And miracle of miracles, old Lucifer began to wake up. It was so long ago that I almost didn't recognize this feeling. The effect was about the same as if someone came out of a 14-month coma. Meanwhile, she continued to talk to me in techie language, and I could not take my eyes off her beautiful face. When we got back to the hotel, I called Gorton. He said Campbell had been drinking all day. I told him about the party and suggested that he keep Mike out of there. Britt stood with me in the hall. I looked at my watch, and we had an hour to change. I asked her if she wanted to have something to drink on the patio. She noted that a woman needs a lot of time and preparation to look effortless. So she said she should go up to her room and do some girly business. I felt disappointed. I think it was noticeable. She gently touched my cheek. It was the first time I had been touched like that since I kissed Janet that historic morning. I think the pain showed on my face because Britt said, "We have to talk about this tonight, Jake. I want to know what you think." This had about 1,000,000 interpretations. I would normally run away from the scene, but I was hopelessly caught in her web. So instead I smiled and said, "See you at Sevena's." I was shaved, showered, and sauntered out onto the patio at exactly Sevena's. It was like I was back in damn high school, hoping Beverly Johnson would be at the dance. The patio was huge, but the people Cone met had reserved a fenced-off area for the entertainment of a select group of guests. I was everything but the elite. I was there because Britt invited me. But Romero was there too. As Romero approached, a gorilla holding a velvet rope led him into the party. After all, he was a big star. He wasn't as helpful when I approached, so I stayed in the public area, waiting for Cone or Britt to notice me and invite me. I wasn't as offended as you might think. I'm used to being excluded from something. However, watching the stars having fun in their own special little territory was a valuable lesson for me. Despite all signs of common sense, I began to think about Britt. She seemed so good, kind, smart, and caring. And it was a magnificent English rose. She had graceful style and a heartbreakingly attractive sense of self. Her natural honesty and decency only made her even more beautiful. And since all that attractiveness came from her soul and not from her stunning face and body, I knew that she would retain the same beauty when she was 88 years old. I couldn't imagine her living with Romero. She was too classy for someone like him, and he was several years younger. But I wouldn't blame her if she tried it over the weekend. After all, he was a walking symbol. And then there was me. I had already started swinging with a woman who was a relative equal to me in society. I couldn't imagine how awkward it would be going to the plate with a world-class beauty like Britt. Finally, I saw her standing with Con and Brett at the side of the buffet table. She just radiated energy, intelligence, and wit. For the event, she dressed casually in a lightweight silk floral dress that showed off modest, gorgeous cleavage and perfectly shaped legs. She was wearing one of those hats and veils that only upper-class English women can wear. But it was this body in a tight silk dress that spoke eloquently to me. She was excited. Romero advanced towards her as if he were a cruise missile, and she was in the center of Pyongyang. They started talking. He stood about 6 inches away from her. She looked a little uncomfortable, but she didn't take a step back. She laughed and held his hand. I assumed she was expressing her interest. I shouldn't have felt anything. Their attraction was natural. She is gorgeous. Him too. But the problem was that I really felt it, and it really hurts. I was completely disgusted with myself. How could I have let my guard down so much? I said under my breath, "This is a lesson I won't soon forget." I was going to get as far away from beautiful people as possible. When Romero said something to Britt, he nodded in my direction. I waved my hand at her weakly. It was a farewell gesture. She looked at me with real anger. I thought, oh damn, she thinks I'm interfering with her little exciting moment with Romero. So I turned sharply and walked out the terrace door. I was really angry with myself. An entire year of treatment was simply thrown into the trash because I was too weak and stupid to follow my own rules. I was too upset to just sit in my room, so I headed to the Explorer pub. I was almost sure that I would find Bill and Mike there. I have restored my protective screens, and I was ready for what the Klingons could throw at me. All three were on the terrace overlooking the inner harbor. This place is the only deep water port on the Côte d'Azur, and it has been there since Hercules was here in the good old days. Bill was glad to see me. I think one of the reasons was Mike. Looks like this guy needed some control tonight. I had no reason to sympathize with Mike, because I had no rights to another sister. But honestly, getting drunk sounded like a great idea. Mike continued to tell us what he was going to do with Khan when he got his hands on him. I finally said, "Look, Mike, it's not Khan's fault. Brett is just that kind of woman. You can't change her. You need to let her go, or she will destroy your soul. And if it's any consolation, Khan will end up in the same situation as you once she gets tired of him." What I wanted to say was, don't waste your time on a narcissistic bitch like Brett. But I knew for sure that this would start a fight. I was also thinking about my unfortunate situation with Britt. I understood that Britt was not a girl like her sister, but the prospect of seeing her and Romero locked in a sweaty embrace a couple of hours later didn't do me any good either. I had a few beers with them while we talked. It was truly a stimulating time spent in ideal conditions, getting an education in Formula One racing. I was born and raised in NASCAR country, and the idea of Italians, Germans, French, and Brits racing down picturesque little European streets in miniature cars seemed pretty funny to me. It wasn't until I saw these cars in action that Dale Jr. Chevrolet suddenly seemed tame and underpowered. Both Bill and the Kuwaiti were betting on the upcoming race, and it turned out that Romero was at the top of the list of potential winners. I knew he would be a big winner tonight. That was enough for me, and the conversation wasn't helping because Campbell kept coming back to how Brett had hurt him. I finally said, "Grow up, Mike. You have to learn to let go of the things that are hurting you." I was actually talking to myself. Campbell jumped out of his chair as if he was going to hit me. I managed to dodge, and Bill grabbed him in the same grip he had used earlier in the day. He quickly said, "Thank you for the evening, Ollie. See you back on the boat." And he led his friend out, muttering, "Come on, you stupid moron." Ollie looked at me, and I smiled and said sadly, "You need to help him understand that he can't make something happen that just can't happen." I was talking to myself again. He said, "I'll try, my friend. In the meantime, please join us on my boat tomorrow. You are more than welcome. And by the way, bring with you this beautiful woman who is so passionate about you." I asked in surprise, "What beautiful woman? I don't remember a single beautiful woman in my life, at least not one that was ever infatuated with me." He said, "Lady Brett's sister, of course. Is there anyone else?" His tone said he thought I was joking. I just sat there, stunned. I said, "Why do you say that? She is undoubtedly somewhere very intimately involved in personal matters with Pedro Romero right now." Ollie laughed and said, "If she is with him, it is only because you let her go." He then stood up, threw a couple of €100 on the table, and left. I was still thinking about his words when my phone rang. I thought it was Bill telling me about Mike's condition. Instead, it was the only other person in Monte Carlo who had my phone number. It was Khan, who sounded worried. He said, "You need to meet me in the hall immediately." Then he hung up. Damn it, Romero took Britt away. I figured he'd seduce her tonight, but kidnapping. I crossed the street, dodging the furious Monegas traffic. This was a situation that required all hands on deck, and I was in a panic. I even remembered thinking, I thought Britt was such a noble woman. I'm such a fool, they are all the same. When I walked through the door, Con was nervously pacing the hall like a typical locked animal. I ran up to him and said breathlessly, "Robert, where is she? I'll kill him if he hurts her." He looked concerned and said, "It's Brett. She's disappeared. I think she's with that guy Romero." At that moment, a concerned voice came from behind me. "Jake, are you okay? Where have you gone?" I turned around and there she stood, looking at me with concern. She was the epitome of beauty and elegance. It was instant. The protective screens exploded. The walls collapsed. And I was unconditionally in the game with this woman. I realize this sounds stupid, but seeing her like this, my heart soared. And if love is a feeling of absolute connection, then I was truly and unconditionally in love with her. Britt is very smart. She instantly understood the picture. I didn't need to say a word to explain myself. I saw a look of compassion and understanding on her face, and I thought I noticed something else. I said, "I thought you were with Romero." She looked shocked and said, "Why did I have to be with him? I was sitting here waiting for you to come back after you ran away." She seemed calm but worried. She certainly knew what I was thinking and gave me the benefit of the doubt over my lack of trust in her. I looked into those smart gray eyes, confused. I said, confused, "It doesn't matter. We can talk later." Then I turned back to Robert and said, "How can we help?" He said, "You left and Britt went looking for you. When she didn't return, I went out to see where she was. She said she was waiting for you here, so I came back and Romero and Brett were both gone. That's when I called you." I was still struggling with my emotions. Britt was waiting for me, but I said, "Let's think about it. There are only two places they could go. The millionth motorhome that follows these guys from race to race, or the pits themselves." I thought he was going to use the same trick on Brett that he tried to use on Britt earlier that day. Only I was sure that Brett would be an easier target. The last thing I wanted was for Khan to discover Romero and Brett having happy sex. So I said, "Why don't you check out his motorhome? They're most likely there. There's a comfortable bed there." I knew we would find them in the pits, but by sending Cohn elsewhere, I hoped to prevent his arrest for the murders of both of them. He said, "Yes, this sounds right. I'll meet you here as soon as I find her." And he rushed away. I turned to Britt and said, "I thought you and Romero would be together tonight. That's why I left. I couldn't bear the thought of you being with him." She looked surprised and cheerful. She said, "Why did you even think I might be interested in that boy? Is that woman there even interesting to you?" She pointed to one of the heavily busty, scantily clad women who had just left a party on a yacht in the harbor. I said, "God, no. There's probably not a part of her body that hasn't been artificially enhanced. I like women who are real, and I might add, with an ick above room temperature. I may be a typical man, but I need to somehow connect with a person before I want to get close to him." She laughed cheerfully and said, "My thoughts are exactly the same. Romero is not someone I would ever contact in that way." We walked hand in hand to the pits. I was absolutely sure that we would find them there. It was a wonderful night. The temperature is ideal, with light breezes carrying the delicate scent of flowers from the hills. After the day's chaos and intensity, it was peaceful in the pits. There were still mechanics there, quietly working on the cars in the illuminated shelters behind the wall of the pits. There were also guards everywhere. Most of them recognized us from that day, but I think it was Britt's beauty that actually gave us a free pass. A beautiful woman can achieve a lot with French and Italian guards. We walked past the Ferrari pits and headed towards the temporary sheds where extra tires and spare parts were stored. I was glad Britt was with me because I knew I would need her help with her sister. I wasn't afraid of Romero. He might have been a champion behind the wheel, but I was almost half a foot taller and 100 pounds heavier. However, I thought that if we interrupted Brett halfway through, I would need Britt's help to pry her claws off my hide. We quietly opened the barn door and heard what was happening. I felt uneasy. Meanwhile, Britt stood nearby, looking as calm as Wellington at Waterloo. She had either seen something like this before or was just so calm. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have a garden hose to turn it on like I do with dogs at home, and they did not offend anyone except, perhaps, Cone. The problem is that he suddenly appeared right behind us. He apparently realized that I was trying to send him on a wild goose hunt and followed us. He took one look at Romero and rushed past us. He hit Romero in the ribs with his shoulder. It was something he must have done to countless Princeton and Yale quarterbacks during his years playing for Harvard. Romero let out a cry of pain, flew into the air, and landed on his back several feet to the side. If he wasn't completely unconscious, he was clearly dazed. He looked absurd, lying there, not moving. The entire time, Britt and I stood side by side, stunned. I was ashamed of both of them. I had no other ideas except some great desire to get out of there. We turned around and left, closing the door behind us. We silently walked back to hotel. When we arrived in the hall, Britt sharply turned to face me. There was a serious and determined look on her face as she said those anxious 5 words. "Jake, we need to talk." I sincerely said, "I know. Where do you want to do it?" The obvious place for privacy was my number, but that was far from the context that we both wanted to create as the planet Tatooine. I said, "I heard that the exotic garden is a good place to sit at night if you want to be alone." She said, "Thank you." It didn't sound as strange as it might have seemed. She thanked me for not inviting her to my room to look at my engravings. I parked the Evoque in a small lot down the street from the garden entrance. It was relatively quiet and peaceful as we entered the garden and then walked down the terraces to a place where we could sit and look out over the Mediterranean Sea and Ville Monaco to the left. The sky was literally deep purple with a million stars interspersed with it. The Mediterranean at night is a special place. The silence and beauty of the surroundings were breathtaking. We found a bench. She sat down next to me, turning towards me but not touching me. She wasn't unfriendly. I just wanted some space. It wasn't romance. This was supposed to be a serious conversation between 2 intelligent people. I recognized the similarities in approach. We both handled things the same way. I said, "When I saw you with Romero, it almost killed me. I don't really know you, and I was afraid that you might turn out like your sister. In retrospect, I very sincerely regret that I ever entertained that thought." She said, "Your mistake is clear. He really clearly harassed me while you were watching us. This was probably reflected in his gestures. I kept pushing him away to make room, but he continued to force himself on me. I didn't know you came until he pointed at me. I could imagine what you were thinking about what was going on between him and me, and that made me angry. He was clearly trying to give you that impression. Then you ran away without giving me a chance to explain. I was looking for you, but you had already disappeared. So I just sat in the hall and waited. I knew that you would return sooner or later. Then Robert came along, and you know the rest. Why are you so upset? I would have approached you as soon as I knew you were here. Does this have anything to do with that cloud that always hangs over you?" I said, "I came home from work one afternoon, and my wife of 5 years ago simply announced that she was leaving me for the man with whom she had been having an affair for 6 months. I trusted her, and I didn't see it coming. Since that day, I have not had the slightest confidence in the moral character or integrity of anyone, especially a woman, and I never get close enough to anyone to let them prove otherwise. I don't want to be like this alienated. It's just the way I am and have been for the last 14 months. I came to France to try to repair the damage done to my self-esteem. I needed to gain a new understanding of who I am and a healthier direction in life. I thought I was starting to recover, but then I saw you and Romero interacting the way you were, and it was déjà vu. I couldn't bear the pain, so I went looking for Bill and Mike. Mike is that poor, unfortunate guy who gave his heart to Brett. I thought I knew how he felt. I realized that I was terribly wrong about you, and I'm sorry. I hope we can get to know each other better." She looked at me with wide eyes, glowing eyes. "I sincerely believe that you are an intelligent and balanced woman who is straightforward and honest. You're as different from Brett as I am from Cone. Their behavior is not even close to what any of us would consider normal." Then she became deadly serious. She said, "Do you see me in the same light as your ex-wife?" This got me thinking. I said, "Janet was smart, funny, and beautiful, just like you. There was just a fundamental flaw that I didn't notice. In my opinion, you are the ideal woman, beauty, intelligence, and kindness in one bottle. And in the very short time that I have known you, your obvious intelligence and superior sense of self-worth have drawn me to you in a way that I have never experienced in my life. I honestly think you are as real as you seem, but I really can't judge that until I get to know you better. I would like to try to do this if you agree." She looked like that was the answer she wanted to hear because she said, "All my life I've been Lady Brett Ashley's little sister. No one has ever judged me for who I am or what I do. They just see me as a younger version of Brett, and the last thing I want is to be like her. I have had several lovers, and perhaps I like sex more than she does. But there has to be something between me and a man before I would even consider allowing him into my body. Without connection, sex is just animal behavior. This can be incredible from a hormonal point of view, but this kind of sex is no different from mating behavior of any other species. And I like to think that I've evolved a little further than that. I need to feel a person's individuality. This is critical because I need to give myself completely to a man to get real satisfaction. Brett's approach to sex without intimacy would destroy my soul. I admitted to myself that my jealousy and overprotectiveness after such a short acquaintance was insane, but the feeling was there, and it was so illogical that it scared me. What was happening to my carefully constructed facade of detached cynicism? Meanwhile, she continued to talk to me. It was as if she didn't realize that I was experiencing terrible attacks of jealousy. She said, "I am aware that men find me attractive, and frankly, it's more frustrating than pleasing. I believe that I am much more than just my appearance. I need a man to want me for my mind and my inner being. The problem is that everyone is trying to put me in this cage, even my colleagues. They joke about how my breasts take away a man's ick because of the distraction they create. Imagine being judged solely by the size of the bulge in your pants, and you'll understand how I feel. So I try really hard to minimize my sexuality." I thought to myself, if she tries to minimize her sexuality, I can't imagine what she would be like if she tried to maximize it. I knew she would be hotter than her sister, and her sister was the hottest woman I've ever met. Britt looked concerned as she said, "I have accomplished some significant things in my short academic career, endeavors and achievements that would define a man. And the only recognition I've received so far is that I'm sexually attractive. This is unfair for a person like me and humiliating. I want to be appreciated for who I am, not what I look like. And my relationship should be based on a union of equals. I want to build a life with a man based on mutual respect between two like-minded people, not based on my appearance or sexuality. When I eventually give myself to a man, I plan to do it for life, and that's a long time. Passion will fade, beauty will fade, but there must always be a connection between one man and one woman in order for me to be happy. From the very beginning, I recognized sincerity in you, your desire to see me as a partner and equal, and not just your woman, which immediately attracted me to you. You also have a magnificent mind, which I absolutely need in a life partner. And honestly, I wanted to take the next step from the moment we met. I know you have good reasons for mistrust. Therefore, I will do everything to make you comfortable and to help you leave the bad experience in the past. But I would like to move forward in our relationship. I promise you won't regret it." All this was said in a neutral tone. It was an exchange of views between two absolutely like-minded people. There were no romantic excesses or passionate feelings in the conversation. The main thing is that there was no hint in the subtext of, "Well, all this is behind us, let's make love," which is so much in such conversations when getting acquainted. This was exactly what I would do if I were looking to make a real connection with another person, and this further strengthened my conviction that Lady Britton Ashley was the woman for me. a special person that I can always trust and share my life with. Isolation and loneliness are not the norm for humans, and I realized that I needed someone, despite all the fake philosophy I put in to convince myself otherwise. But after everything I had been through, commitment to a woman required me to have complete, unshakable confidence in the constancy of her soul. This smart, honest, and at the same time, absolutely charming woman offered to build a relationship with me carefully and thoughtfully, and I was confident enough that she had the natural intelligence and nobility to take this step. I leaned towards her, and she leaned towards me in the same style. It was literally a magical, mesmerizing moment. The first touch of lips was the sweetest and most natural kiss I had ever received, without passionate open mouths or wild dueling tongues. There were also no fireworks or loud symphonic music. It was simply a complete and unconditional merging of two people. When we kissed, all the missing pieces fell into place, and I became whole again. I would be a complete fool to ignore the significance of this wonderful event. We parted. She moaned softly. You could see a flash of wild passion in her gorgeous gray eyes. But then the armored doors slammed shut. She had Brett's white-hot inner fire, but he was under strict control. I knew I would see this passion again, but this will only be at the time and place of her choice. I appreciated that she was in careful control of her sexuality. No man in his right mind wants a woman who can't control her base instincts. That was the problem with Janet and Brett. Britt's strict self-discipline and her moral strength were the two things I loved most about her. I said, as far as I'm concerned, this kiss seals our deal. I can't believe my incredible luck. This has never happened to me. But that moment, as soon as I touched your lips, I knew that you were the woman for me. I believe that you are real, and we can do this. We didn't make love that first night, or even while we were in Monte Carlo. We were actually committed to each other for almost a month before we got to that part of our relationship. We watched the race from a Kuwaiti boat. Romero had a bad day, eventually retreating, complaining of fatigue. Most likely, the cause was bruised ribs. Britt stood out even among other beautiful people, but her exceptional beauty meant nothing to both of us. We were together in the crowd. We always exchanged glances as we moved around, and she constantly let me know that she was next to me, even if she was standing 50 feet away talking to other people. Her strong and unconditional companionship was much better than hot sex. After 34 years and one failed marriage, I finally experienced what it was like to have a true life partner. I was no longer outside on the porch. She led me inside, and I found peace. The crowd of merry revelers became too much for too many, so I leaned on the boat railing, trying to find some time to myself. She came to lean next to me. She nudged me with her shoulder. In my opinion, this playful little thing was a much more intimate gesture, and it was much more meaningful and important. She looked towards the harbor at the exotic garden and said, I wish I was there now instead of here. Of course, I was thinking the same thing. For the first time in my life, it was interesting to be associated with a person who shared my interests and views on life. Watching the races was boring, and communicating with rich people was tiring. Britt grew up in the aristocracy. I am sure that a well-bred young English aristocrat would never shirk her social responsibilities. But as platitudes and empty chatter oppressed my soul, I also had the feeling that her growing up must have been painful. I had two thoughts. I kept the first one with me, but I still couldn't help but think about her. Really, an English noble lady as beautiful as this woman chose me? I'm clearly living in some kind of Lewis Carroll fairy tale. The second thought was more important. I said, You're as bored as I am, aren't you? She nodded in anticipation and said, I'd love to be somewhere alone with you, just reading and talking. Do you like swimming? I love the peace and quiet of being alone on a boat with someone. I didn't ask. I was pretty sure I couldn't handle the story of her and Sir Percy on Windermere. I said, This is my idea of a perfect day. My ex couldn't sit still long enough to do this, let alone enjoy it. I have a small 32-foot boat that I sail on the Potomac. but my only companion was my old dog Buster. She laughed and said, "We have a whole life ahead of us, and I'm the best boatswain in the whole fleet, Captain." She stood at attention and gave me the British open palm salute. The mischievous smile on her beautiful face was no less impressive than the movement of her large breasts as she threw her shoulders back. Of course, she had her own plans for the trip, and I had mine, so we broke up that evening. I wasn't upset at all. I knew we would be together for the rest of our lives, so our temporary separation only fueled our desire for each other. She flew out of Nice. I took the guys back to Paris. It then took me a few weeks to get things sorted out at home. The main delay was simply making space for us to live together. Her father was a hereditary count. Her mother had died the year before, and Brett had been disinherited years before. So Britt was his only direct heir. Because the rules of succession for the British aristocracy have not changed much since the time of William the Conqueror, Britt could not inherit the earldom. But most of the estate in Gloucestershire passed to her. Her father was still strong and healthy, and unless something unexpected happens, it will be some time before we settle in the Count's house. Neither of us were the typical lord or lady of the manor. Britt did challenging and somewhat pioneering work at Oxford, and she didn't want to give it up. I never would have expected her to do this. Where I ended up was not the question. With my money, I could live in a yurt in Patagonia, and if Britt had been there, the yurt would have been just fine for me. So Oxford was the logical place. Britt, of course, had her own money too, but I had so much of it in my bank account earning interest that I offered to buy a place near the university if she decided to move in with me. Or at the very least, I could rent something close enough to her so that we could slowly ease into the relationship. Being a prudent woman, she chose the second option. She said, "I want this to work, and I want to lay a solid foundation before we just dive into a relationship. I love you. I will always love you. But I want to live happily with you for the rest of our lives, and life is something we have to approach thoughtfully." And that, gentlemen, is what fundamentally distinguished Britt from all the other women I've ever known. We talked and texted a lot while we were apart. She called me a couple of weeks after we broke up to tell me that there was a vacancy at Ockle. If I took her over, we could work together. This decision took about a nanosecond. The next morning, I checked out of the hotel and headed down the A1 towards Calais. In theory, it's only a 3-hour trip, but given the traffic leaving Paris, it's closer to 4 hours. Accordingly, I did not reach Dover until early in the day, and I reached Oxford only in the evening. I got a number in Randolph and called her. She expected to hear from me the next day, and she sounded absolutely ecstatic to hear from me a day early. The contrast with Janet was obvious. It seemed that the time apart had taken its toll on my future wife. This was the complete opposite of the attitude of the one who was the wife. Janet usually saw the separation as an opportunity to do other things, whereas, from the tone of her voice, it seemed like the only thing Britt wanted to do was me. We met at the Morse Bar. Yes, Oxford's only 5-star hotel has named its main bar after a TV character. I was sitting in the back bar with its luxurious wood paneling when she walked in through the Beaumont Street entrance. It was a warm, clear evening outside. She must have walked 5 minutes from Ockle down St. Giles to Randolph. She was dressed in a light silk dress suitable for good weather. The dress accentuated her gorgeous round butt like a frame around a Renoir painting. She was looking for me, smiling her mysterious smile. Her face absolutely lit up when she saw me. Was it a choir of angels? Or were they simply tuning into evening prayer somewhere? It seemed like we were never apart. It's been 3.5 weeks since we last saw each other, and she was as charming as always. I sat with 2 Balvenie fingers in front of me. We hugged, and she kissed me on the cheek like a sister and ordered the same. Even after almost a month, it wasn't a big deal. We are not people of big events. Anything else would be different from us, and this strengthened our subconscious connection. She simply glowed with energy and happiness. I said, "Working late, honey?" She replied, I wanted to finish all the work on the project for the rest of the week. I'm going to spend a lot of time getting to know you a lot better, so to speak. There was no doubt what she meant. We spent a polite and courteous period discussing the news. We wanted to make our hasty exit from the bar and up to my room dignified, if not entirely subtle. Soon after this, I lay waiting on the bed. She left the bathroom and walked into the dim light of the drawn curtains. She was great. Her perfect body, with large, high breasts and a flat stomach, flaring hips, was highlighted by shadows. Those long, muscular legs carried her in that feminine way that women run. She arrived in a hurry and landed next to me laughing. She positioned herself so that she was lying naked on her back on the bed. She just looked up at me. I lay next to her, leaning on one elbow. I looked into her infinitely deep and beautiful gray eyes, seeing in them the play of intelligence and strength, like summer lightning on a wide prairie. I also saw her immeasurable passion waiting there like a ferocious predator. I felt her gaze pulling me towards her with that feminine power that is the essence of a woman, embracing and restoring, passionate, restoring and strengthening. The strength of her mind and her absolute humanity were open and visible in those inscrutable eyes. She gave herself to me completely, shamelessly, and without reservation. This feeling in itself spoke volumes about the depth of her soul and the depth of the reservoirs of passion that she was willing to share with the right person. I have known many women in my life, but I have never participated in such a display of sexuality as I just witnessed. I didn't even want to tell her normal things. All I wanted to do was worship her. There is something at the core of all men's brains that knows that the survival of the species depends on female sexuality. This is probably why the religions of all primitive societies are built around female goddesses. Brit just proved how deeply and powerfully fundamental her sexuality is. I'm sure if she did something like that in front of our primitive ancestors, they would run and carve an idol in her honor. Since I was the only man present, all I could do was look at her in complete bewilderment and say with admiration, "This incredible woman is mine." It was a true association of equals. She is a wonderful woman and the most passionate lover you can imagine. But her physical charms pale in comparison to her dedication to fighting whatever life throws at us, never leaving my side. We have experienced many events in our lives, but there is only one person who has experienced all of them with me, that is her. The real reward of our marriage lies in the intimate sharing of these moments. We've gone through trials and rewards always side by side. We are like Arctic bulls in the face of any opponent, standing back to back with horns pointing outward. Each protects the other's back from the wolves. The incredible luck of meeting and marrying this woman, who I still consider head and shoulders above me, is a once-in-a-lifetime event. But let's say that's the lesson. The truth is that your life is no more meaningful than the sum of the people who are part of it. This is something I've always missed in all my philosophical musings at the Stade de France. In reality, we are all just getting through life. No script. And we never know when some random person or event will swoop in and redefine everything. Also, success lies in nothing more than the ability to recognize the significance of a thing when it appears and then boldly act on this understanding. That's what happened to Britt and me. We were not sure where the significant events in Monte Carlo would lead, but we definitely realized that each of us is important to the other, and we have taken the necessary steps to strengthen our bond. We then worked long and hard over all these years to make this connection last. I lived a happy life until my 50th birthday. During this time, Brett and Cone married each other twice. I heard that they decided to officially register an open marriage. As I said before, they deserve each other. Gorton and Campbell returned to the States. I wished both of these old Marines good luck. Romero became a two-time Formula One world champion and also won Indy. I also wished him good luck. I actually won a real prize. We've been married for almost 16 years, and in my eyes, my wife is as fresh and beautiful as the day we met in Monte Carlo. But now she shares the love of my life with my beautiful Brooke. You are right, we continued the theme of alliteration. Brookie has been my pride and joy and partner in crime since the moment she was born. Her beauty and intelligence match her mother, although she is only 14 years old. We live on part of the estate that Britt's father gave us in trust. Inheritance taxes here are huge. I built our house to match the Earl's castle, or whatever they call it, with almost 30 bedrooms. The main difference is that our heating and plumbing are 4 centuries more modern. I'm not a fan of being outside, but it's fun to look at my 200 acres of land. And both my girls like to ride horses, so they have a lot of space for horse activities. Brooke is part of the UX Excel Talent Development Program, a program that trains potential young Olympians. She rides a chestnut horse that looks so noble and majestic that her previous job must have been leading the storm of the Light Brigade. And 14-year-old Brooke manages it with the same imperturbable calm as Lord Cardigan himself. Like many members of the British nobility, Brit is an accomplished horsewoman. This is one of the many things she does better than mere mortals like me. She controls her sullen black stallion with the same firmness, tenderness, and grace that she controls everything else in her life, and he reacts to her like a little dog comes to life, although I swear I've seen him blow off steam sometimes. More fittingly, I had one last call with the woman who made my life possible. I would like to tell you about this. Brit's father has a world-class collection of French impressionists, which he was persuaded to lend to the guys from Corcoran. Brit and I went to start collecting. Brit was there to represent her father, the Earl, and I agreed because I love her and didn't want to spend time away from her. I sold the flat a long time ago when I retired and became an English squire, so we stopped in Madison on the 15th while we were in Washington. I stood at the gruesome opening, showing that places like Corcoran always put on events the night before to make wealthy donors feel pampered. For the Count's daughter Brit has gone off to do her noble work. I was in the far corner, pressed up against the most beautiful girl in the room. She was wearing an overgrown navy blue cocktail dress, 4-inch heels, and her hair was styled like a grown woman's. I was holding a glass with scotch, and she was holding something with strawberries and lemonade. My wife finds my protective attitude towards my little girl ridiculously cute. But now that Brooke is turning into an even more stunning version of Brit, I'm starting to think about a monastery on a remote island. On the other hand, Brooke shares her mother's exceptional intelligence and self-esteem, so I guess I'll have to settle for her navigating the waters of a young woman as skillfully as her mother. And she would always have a supremely sensible mother to turn to if she ever needed advice. Brooke must be the only teenager on the planet who thinks her parents are cool. I attribute this to Brit's stern but loving upbringing, as well as the fact that Brooke and I both regularly get into trouble with Brit due to some criminal misadventure we just committed. My role is to teach her to be self-sufficient and courageous. We stood in front of Degas. Brooke spoke very seriously and knowledgeably about working with a brush. I looked at Brit. That's when I noticed Worm and Janet enter the building. Being major donors, the people of Corcoran held them to pay their respects to the Earl's daughter. I thought to myself, of course, you can always count on people like them to show up at a high-profile event like this. I thought Janet was actually going to be curtsy to Brit when she was introduced. The Worm's expression was more reminiscent of carnal lust. It was obvious that he had a wandering eye. Brit glanced at me as they were introduced. She caught the name. I nodded. She went into full aristocracy mode. It was an incredible transformation. My smart, funny, and practical wife could teach Queen Elizabeth the first lessons about class superiority and imperial behavior. The words royal and aloof come to mind. All three talked for a couple of minutes. Janet looked both awestruck and starstruck, while Worm tried to look into Brit's little black dress. Brit then turned with the two of them and led them across the room towards me and Brooke. They looked puzzled. The years have not been kind to Janet. She looked older than her real age, and she had a restless, nervous manner. Meanwhile, Worm was in all-out seduction mode with Brit. They both looked completely stunned when they got close enough to notice who Brit was leading them to. It was as if I jumped up from the floor, like the devil himself. Janet said with deep condescension oozing from her voice. Why, Jake, what are you doing at such an event? This is not your type of audience. The worm looked at me as if I were something he had just walked into and said, Yeah, that's too cultured for you, isn't it? Don't you feel a little out of place? I said cheerfully, and hello to you too. It's been a long time, hasn't it? What a difference 16 years and a good woman can make. I said, You're right. Events like this really bore me. I'm just here to support my wife. Janet asked with slightly jaded interest, Oh, your wife is on the committee that organizes this event. I replied, Not really. Their faces again looked like they couldn't understand why Britt had brought them to talk to nobody like me. I added, I came here mainly to introduce my daughter to Washington society. They both turned to Brooke, who was standing next to me, looking at them with an arrogant look that was perhaps even a little more arrogant than the one Henry Roman VIII gave his ex-wife. They said simultaneously and with complete surprise, Is she your daughter? I must admit that Brooke was a strikingly beautiful young woman. In her grown-up dress and heels and her developing body, she probably looked 25. I said, Yes, meet Lady Brooke Ashley Barnes. You could see them doing the math in their heads. Janet then turned to Britt with complete bewilderment. Is Jake your husband? I said, smiling, 16 wonderful years already. Britt walked up to Brooke and me, lovingly took my hand and said, Jake and I met in Monte Carlo, and from the minute I saw him, I adored him. We live on an estate in Gloucestershire, but we still work part-time at GCHQ in Cheltenham. Our daughter goes to boarding school in Dean Close. Brooke, who clearly didn't appreciate the way Janet and Trash were treating me, said in her most aristocratic tone, with her lip curled up, Yeah, only the best people get ready there. Ordinary people like you don't qualify. I understood what she was doing. Brooke usually sounds like her mother rather than Princess Diana. Both Janet and Trash looked absolutely stunned. I couldn't help myself. I turned to the treacherous bitch, and with all the fake sincerity he could muster, he said, You were right, Janet. I would never have had this wonderful life if it weren't for you. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. Janet understood. She didn't like it, but she understood. Then I turned to the two most beautiful women in the world and said, We have accomplished our mission here. Don't you think it's time to leave? Britt smiled at me with her beaming smile and said in her deep Belgravian accent, Of course, dear. It's really tiring being around all these boring pretenders. The implication was clear. The worm and its companion were rejected. My two loves took me by the arms and we turned to leave, but not before I stole a glance at Janet. She looked at her companion with complete desperation while he looked lustfully at Britt's ass. Her look of utter disgust and contempt was priceless. I thought to myself, George Herbert was right. Living well is truly the best revenge. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.